At its core, podcasting is pretty simple. What makes podcasting so complicated is us, the podcasters, trying to give our audience what they want. But is it what we need? Hello and welcome to another Podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. There's an old adage in business that says that work will expand to fit the time allotted for it. I think we could say something similar about podcasting and complexity, though I don't yet really have a clever idiom to share with you on the show. Maybe I'll come up with one in the next few hours before I post the actual episode live. Here's the reality. Complexity creep happens, especially in creative endeavors, where we have at best a set of guidelines and maybe a roadmap, but not like a clear format and schedule to follow. It's like building things with Legos if you want to think about it this way, right? We start pretty simple. There's one block on another block, then we add another one, and before we're too terribly long, you can create the entire Las Vegas Strip in Legos if you want to. That's all really complicated, but at its core, they're just Legos. They're just plastic blocks. They're not terribly complicated. But when we do build something really complicated with our podcast, not with Legos, when we build our podcast, we started out simple. And then we added more layers of complexity onto it, until now we have this complex thing that we have to constantly support. And it stresses us out. It's not good for our self-worth, our self-care, when things get too complicated for us. And ultimately, we might decide just simply to quit the show. And maybe that's a good thing, but maybe it's just simply a situation where we had added in too much complexity and we needed to get back to basics. The challenge is going to be, how do you make your show less complex without impacting A, your livelihood, or B, your audience's enjoyment of the show? Let's try and unpack that on this episode. I think the first thing that you do is, rather than starting to look at your show, which is everybody's first inclination, let me just jump in and see where the complication is, and I'll just extract it. Well, good luck. I have another idea for you to do, and it's an examination of wants and needs. Now, the way I want you to think about this, though, is first off, I want you to really sit down and think about what it is you want out of the show, what you want out of this show. Maybe it goes back to why you started doing it in the first place. Maybe. I've been doing this for 16 years, not this show. I've been doing this show for 3 years, right? I want something out of it now that I didn't want out of it originally. So that's up to you. But sit and think about what it is you really want out of the show. I really can't help you figure that out, but you need to sit down and make a list. Things that you want out of the show. But it's want. Juxtapose that with the second thing you have to do. And that's break down, try, if you can, and understand what your audience needs from your show. What needs do they have that your show fulfills currently? Not what it could fulfill, but what it's actually fulfilling right now. Now, there's a difference there. Again, it's what you want out of the show, and it's what your audience needs out of the show. Not the reverse. Definitely not the reverse. If you go down the track, the worst one is the audience. If you go down what your audience wants, look, I've talked about this before. Your audience always wants the same thing, more. And their wants aren't really important. It's about what they need, really. What they need and what you want to deliver to them. All right, so now that you've got an understanding of what your wants are and what their needs are, now start looking at all of the elements of your show. And what I mean by elements are certainly the components that make up the show itself, like your intro and your outro, for example. Just something as simple as that. You'd think is simple can get really complex. Have you overly complicated that? Do you want that? Does your audience need that? Is that the way it has to be? Maybe you're doing interviews and you look at this and you go, I don't really need to do this. My audience wants interviews. I get that, but do they need it? Does my audience need interviews? And maybe the answer is yes. You couldn't do your show without your interviews. Okay, but if you don't want to do the interviews, maybe somebody else does the interviews. I was doing an interview program a long time ago, and I decided that I didn't want to do that anymore. So I let somebody else do the interviews, and I did the rest of the bits. What about your production process? All the things that you are doing in the chain to make the show, from pre-production all the way to post-production and scheduling. Do you want all of those pieces? Does your audience need all of those pieces? Do you need to be the one to do it? Can somebody else do it? Can you simplify it and really break it down? What about your collaborations you're working with? Your entire publishing regimen? All of it can get really, really, really complicated. And so when you look at all of these areas of complexity, rather than just excising them, look at them from the point of view of your wants and your audience's needs. And I suggest that instead of going in wholesale and getting rid of everything, the real trick here is to take this one step at a time. Start small with very incremental, if you will, decomplexifying, or simplifying. It's a simpler way to say that, Evo. Just slowly start taking away one thing at a time that you don't want to do and your audience doesn't need for you to do. Remove that complexity and don't make a big deal out of it. Don't go on your show and spend 5 minutes talking about how stressed out and how bad things are and you're going to make sweeping changes. That just scares people. And here's the deal. You're not doing it, this is going to sound weird, for your audience. You're going to still give your audience what they need. This is about what you want. And you don't always have to take your wants and make them publicly available. You make changes to your show all the time in the background without telling anybody. This is another one of those. Don't make it a big deal. But also don't do it as it's a big deal either. Again, one thing at a time. Remove it if you don't want to do it and you don't think your audience needs it, and go along for a little while, and then do another, and another, and another, whatever it takes until you get back to the happy spot you really have to occupy to keep your audience entertained. This is about simplifying the process and then simply making the podcast you want and the podcast your audience needs. You can get back to that if you've gotten away from it. Now, 2 things before I let you go. 1, if you know of a fellow podcaster out there who might be overcomplicated things, send them this episode, along with a personal note telling them that they should be listening to the show, that episode, obviously, and the entire show. Remember, the only way that podcast pontifications goes. Why? Is the anesthesia still in my head? Maybe so. The only way the show grows is when working podcasters share the show with other working podcasters. So please tell a friend about Podcast Pontifications. And if you love what I have to say, consider going to buymeacoffee.com/EvoTerra, where you can sign up and become a member of the program. I've got a couple of small perks that members actually get, so you'll get more information about that, or just reach out to me if you want to know more about what that is all about. Right, that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day. I shall be back tomorrow with yet another Podcast Pontifications. Cheers!